So hello and welcome this afternoon. To a session on supporting students with speech, language and communication needs with a special focus on developmental language disorder. So I'm Stephen Parsons and I am from NAPLIC, which I'll talk about a little bit later. No, we're actually on this slide, actually, sorry. So NAPLIC is a UK organisation for all professionals who work with children and young people with speech, language and communication needs, and including those with developmental language disorder. And we're very small, we're all volunteers, but we run a conference, we run lots of CPD events specifically around speech, language and communication needs, and we focus on developing professional skills, service development, but also particularly around awareness of DLD. We're very cheap to join, around about £20 per year. We're a very passionate group of people really dedicated to the cause. Okay, so a little bit about me. So I'm also Chair of RADLD, which is the Raising Awareness of Developmental Language Disorder, which I'll talk about a few minutes later. I am currently Chair of NAPLIC, but only for a couple more weeks. And I'll be handing over to my great colleague, Victoria Wadsworth. And then also, so RADLD and NAPLIC are both volunteer, and then I guess what I do to pay the bills is develop resources, do training and things like that. So language for thinking, and then the Word Aware book 1, 2 and 3, which is all about vocabulary and language, behaviour and emotions, some of those. And then also working on a project with funded by the Education Endowment Foundation, currently looking at children's learning of early years children's learning of concepts. Okay, so and that impact on maths in particular. Okay, so that's really keeping me busy. I'm a speech and language therapist by background, have been for about 35 years as well. So just, I guess, I can't see any of you. That's one of the things about this talking this kind of weird world. I have no non-verbals. I don't know who's here. I'm just looking in my room in Norfolk, talking to a blank screen. So I don't know whether there's even anyone I know in the audience, or your level of knowledge. So excuse me if I'm teaching you to suck eggs. So speech, language, communication needs, I guess to make it sure we're all on the same page. Okay, so the speech part refers to the sound that we hear. Okay, so a common speech error for young children would be something like saying tar for car. Okay, so they would just make that substitute a t for a k sound, but it also includes stammering, like fluency, hesitancy. And then the language aspect is the words and sentences that involves both speaking and understanding. And communication is how we use those words, sentences and speech to interact with each other. And the term speech, language, communication is largely educational in terms of its usage, and that's where it comes from. It's largely UK. It's being picked up a couple of other countries, but influenced heavily by the UK. And it doesn't require a formal diagnostic process. There's no sort of procedure to it. It can just be, it's observational. And I guess it's huge and increasing. So Speech and Language UK, who are a large charity in this field, do an annual survey, I think, or biannual. I can't, quite regularly they do surveys, large surveys of teachers and how many children are you concerned about with speech, language and communication needs. And the number they extrapolate is 1.9 million, which is a very large number, and that's a significant increase on previous years. So the number increase of concern continues to increase year on year. Okay, and speech and communication needs can have an impact across learning, literacy, behaviour, mental health. I was looking at some figures this morning, and if we look at GCSEs levels 4 to 9 in maths and English, so in 2019, 71% of all young people achieved that standard. Only 20% of those identified with speech, language and communication needs achieve that level, okay, which is considerably less than say students with autism, right, who are around about 38% from memory. Okay, so about half the number who achieve that level of autism. So speech, language, communication needs has very significant impacts on learning, but also obviously on mental health. And we're in Mental Health Awareness Week. This session is not particularly around mental health, but it is, has a very big impact, which we'll talk about a little bit later. If you stop the kind of average person in the street and said, what causes speech, language and communication needs, if they understood what that term meant, they would probably say something about, oh, it's to do with technology. Okay, it's parents, you know, those negligent parents ignoring their children on their phones all the time, or children on their screens all the time. And whilst there's probably an element of truth to that, it's far more complex than that. Because first of all, we've had these concerns for many years, and whilst they are accelerating, that have been around for many years. And the other side of that, and probably quite often overlooked, is the nature side. Okay, so nature referring to the actual what children are born with, right? The nurture side referring to the environment, so what children are exposed to. So both are important. So the home learning environment, the school learning environment are very important, but also children are born with different aptitudes for language. You know, as with running races or something, right? It's the same thing. So, and many of those children who have difficulties with learning language would fit the criteria for developmental language disorder. So this is a relatively new term in terms of an agreement. There was a mishmash, it was a total mess before, until 2016, when a big group of international experts got together and had a big sort of agreement process, consensus process, and they came up with this term. And developmental just means it starts in childhood. Okay, so that is something like meaning. So it's something about how the child develops, how human development, right? But that doesn't mean it goes away. That's one thing. Okay, the language refers to the words and sentences. Okay, vocabulary, grammar, conversational inference, but also understanding and expression. So both of those. And the disorder is the part that lots of people may have difficulties with, including myself. It's just that it is a bit medical, but I guess it's showing that it's something of different functioning, I guess, is probably how you would perhaps term it. Okay, so rather than thinking about what each word stands for, it's actually easier just to call it DLD. Okay, DLD is a trouble, an issue with learning language, and specifically not learning language from the routine exposure that most children learn language from. So not picking up the patterns of either, you know, the vocabulary, so needing more repetitions, having to hear words many more times than typically developing children, or needing to hear or have explicitly taught structures to do with sentences and grammar, for instance. So it has a genetic biological basis. So we see it in all languages, all children. Okay, so it's not related to English as additional language. So we would expect to see it in a child's home language. So a child speaks more than one language. We might notice it in English, in the school language, but we would also see it in their home language. So the issue can be with English as additional language learners is that the family can presume, oh, they're learning English, that's why their home language isn't developing, and school can be saying, oh, they're bilingual, they've got maybe the home language, but they're just a bit slow to learn English, right? But actually putting the two together, we learn that it's an issue in both languages. But also it's across dialects, so it presents differently. You know, English or all languages have a huge variation in how they're spoken, accents, and and dialect in terms of grammatical structures and vocabulary. Okay, but we see it across all languages and all dialects. And this is the profile is, so apologies slightly probably for the actual color in terms of figuration of its pattern, but this is the colors of RADLD. The purple is the RADLD color, so try to make it match with that, but it makes it the clarity of it not always stand out quite as well as we would hope. Okay, so first of all is to point out that every person with DLD will present in slightly different ways. There are certain factors, but actually there's a lot of variation as well. But these are the core areas likely to be impacted. So I'll start over on the red area over here is words, vocabulary. Okay, so is typically a difficulty for many people with DLD. So we'll largely have a smaller vocabulary, okay, and might overuse a smaller range of words. So rather than saying something like I'm having trouble with my vocabulary right now. Rather than saying I bought some biscuits, they might say I got some biscuits. Okay, so really overusing those general kind of verbs. And a typical feature might be something around word finding difficulties, as I had just then, that hesitancy, but not just like I had then with just a small hesitation over one word occasionally, but actually hesitating, having real troubles thinking of the right words, regularly. Okay, that's a very common issue for people with developmental language disorder. Another key area we'll see is sentences. So some difficulties with the grammar aspects. Okay, so putting words into sentences, so talking in short sentences, maybe not combining them with conjunctions. Okay, so the and, the because, so not forming longer sentences, and then also things like the tense markers. So using, so rather than saying went, they might say, for a young child, they might say goed, but that carrying on that pattern much longer than typically developing children do. And then discourse is the conversational skills. Okay, so being able to hold a conversation, so put sentences together to form longer, like narratives, so longer storytelling opportunities, but then also not being able to understand the intention, so other people's what other people mean as well. Okay, so that picks up a little, crosses over a little bit with social language as well. So social language is the ability then to, what does the speaker, what do they mean, and being able to join in those conversations and really make sense together. Okay, and learning and memory is the being able to follow an instruction, or also follow instructions. So difficult remembering sounds and words as well. So generally that kind of recall aspects as well. So many people with DLD will have issues or difficulties with most of these areas here. The one that varies the most is the speech sound, so sound clarity. So some people with DLD will have no difficulties with this area, and others will have significant needs here as well. Okay, so that gives you an overview of just generally of DLD. And I guess the issue is it can start to look a little bit like other conditions, and so probably the tricky one to have a look at is something like ADHD. All right, because if a person has difficulties with learning and memory, it can look, and they might have difficulties. They can look a little bit like ADHD. If they're having difficulties with the social language, holding conversations, it can look a lot like autism. And particularly if they're having difficulties, again, with learning and memory, is with following, knowing what's going to happen, the structure of the day, what's happening next, then they might become a little bit more comfortable with routines. Okay, and because actually they like the routine, it's comforting. Okay, so again, it can get very similar to autism in some ways. But okay, just to keep coming back to our SLCN versus developmental language disorder, is so the researchers show that DLD is around 7.6% of the population, and if we carry it out to this language disorder associated with, which I won't go into today, but that's around about 10%. That's when DLD is, or language disorder is, part of another condition. Here, and then the SLCN would be a bigger umbrella term, and we can't really relate these directly to each other because DLD comes from a sort of a, I guess, a medical, scientific kind of psychological background, and SLCN comes from an educational background, and so they're kind of different viewpoints, and how they are constructed is different. But there, you would say that DLD is a subset of SLCN, and probably at least half, potentially a higher percentage of those with SLCN would have DLD. And DLD is common. Okay, so 7.6% equates to 2 children in every class of 30 on average. Okay, so it's a very, very common condition, and way more common than similar, more well-known conditions. So autism is around 1 to 2%. People will argue about the percentages. It depends again how but that's the kind of general average of the diagnostic rates. ADHD again varies massively according to the researchers, but it's around about this. Dyslexia probably even varies even more, again, because it's not agreed. DLD, this has been repeated by a couple of studies, one in Britain and one in the States. They came up with very similar figures, even though they use slightly different criteria. So, so 2 in every 30. And then if we add that on, so DLD is on its own 7.6%, but it could be, say, as part of another condition. So you might have, say, you can have autism associated with language disorder or associated with Down syndrome. Then you account those children who weren't developing as having a language disorder associated with, and that takes up to about 10%. Okay, so 3 children in every class of 30. And the issue is with DLD is it is very, very hard to spot. Okay, and I think that's, you know, one of the big barriers that have caused it, why it's so hidden, is it's very hard, you know, it's just so unknown and so hard to spot. So I guess the first thing, just looking at the slide, most people don't know about DLD, so they do not go looking. All right, so if you don't know about it, you can easily get by either thinking how some person's having difficulties is caused by something else, or just not even recognizing the difficulties, and that may be the individual themselves. All right, so most people with DLD don't know they've got it, and because this terminology is only changed in 2016 and we're at the very, very beginnings of awareness, there are very few adults who have this diagnosis. Very few. There's no diagnostic pathway for adults in the UK on the NHS, right? There's none. So most adults don't know they've got it. So they experience themselves, they explain it in some other way, and often that is around, I'm stupid. All right, so all of that, people don't go looking for it. It's very hard to spot just by looking at a child. Again, you might just think they've got learning difficulties, you might think they've got attention difficulties, you might think they've got dyslexia, any of those things. All right, so it's easy to there. And then even to make it trickier is that DLD is hidden in terms of masquerading, masking, camouflaging, all of those things, is that children don't put their hand up and say, I don't understand, right? That doesn't happen that often. Is what they do is they come up with little coping strategies, copying others, smiling and nodding. Okay, all of those things contribute to making it harder to spot. So I was going to talk a bit about screening, and then I decided not to. I took the slides out, but it probably is worth thinking about for a moment. There are lots of language screening tools available, commercially available, and I guess one of the things is just to be cautious of their use. Is what they can lead to is false negatives or false positives. So if you get a false positive as a child who's typically developing, who is then identified as having some kind of language needs, and then may get some extra support they don't need, so potentially a waste of resource, or you can get false negatives. False negatives. So a child who does have good has language needs, has language needs, and gets and is missed by the assessment. All right, so they're absolutely just skipped over, and therefore in a couple of years' time, no one thinks, oh, they don't have any language needs. They passed that language screening in reception or year 1. And so it's this kind of false reassurance. So no tool is 100% reliable, but just to be very aware of the reliability of the tools that you're using to identify. And even if you are using a tool, is really to be thinking about checking a common sense check with those children. I do remember in my early career, I was just reflecting on this recently, is that I was working in a specialist provision, and I was working with a child who had really significant language needs, and he had very poor attention. So I thought I'll do this really quick language screen. This tool on him. He passed it. And I remember talking to his teacher going like, how on earth did he pass it? And then look at it. It was perfectly random. He just pointed to a picture. all right? And that will happen if you're screening lots of children in your school. Then there's a chance that there will be a random chance that some children pass it just because of random chance. Okay, so just be careful. So I think better is to have a common sense check, is that everyone is looking, everyone is knows about it and keeps looking, right? Because also there's researchers who've done longitudinal studies. There are some children who just pass an assessment when they're preschool or early years, and then by the end of primary they actually haven't gone on quite the trajectory that we would expect, and so therefore they end up a bit below. All right, so you've got to really keep on checking, but then also to think about is second look. So this 7.6%, 2 in every class of 30, oh my god, there's more kids with SEN, there's more to add to the SEN register. Not necessarily, because I think a lot of these kids we already know. You already know, all right? If you're a SENCO in school, you already know them, all right? And if you're a class teacher, you're already concerned about them for other reasons. And often that is behavior, okay? So we have children who show exhibiting behaviors, and researchers, there's lots of different studies have been done looking at vulnerable groups of young people with their SEMH, youth justice system improves, etc. Very high percentages of them have a language disorder, usually undiagnosed. And if you look at the youth justice populations, it can be really, really high. 95% I've seen quoted have some language disorder, and almost all of them have never had any contact or assessment for language. All right, so I guess if you look at behavior, think about the language. It might not be obvious. It can sometimes be, sometimes it is very obvious, sometimes it can be very subtle. So actually you're better off thinking that a child who has behavior difficulties has language difficulties. So look for, presume they do to start, and then rule it out is a better way of working. Also, if you're looking at children who are experiencing difficulties with reading, language and reading are intertwined. So children who have language needs are highly, highly likely to have difficulties with reading. They can have difficulties with decoding. Again, may not, but they are most definitely going to have difficulties with comprehending. So there's a bit. So have a look at the children who have difficulties with reading, and particularly the poor comprehenders. So even if they are decoding fluently, are they able to understand what they're reading? Okay, so be careful, be cautious, and watch out for those children. And then the other ones we have, so we have the behavior ones who are the external, showing their frustration, their anger, acting out. Okay, but the other side of that are the internalizers. So the ones who sink quietly at the back, all right, and particularly if they're EAL, because there can be an assumption that, oh, that they'll speak better in their home language, or to students who speak their home language, and they're just not as right. And be very, very cautious of that assumption. Working with families in particular, so or bilingual staff who can have a conversation with the student as well. And again, similarly with the selectively mute children, so children who are not speaking in school or reluctant to speak in school, they have a higher chance that they also have DLD. So you can check their language by doing their understanding. So looking at with a point response or a written response, for instance. And a lot of these children, these quiet ones, might even cope relatively well in primary because they establish a peer group, supportive friends. They can copy a lot. Once they get to secondary, this can becomes much more complex, and actually have a lot of them have mental health needs when they get to secondary. So we need to get their identification and support in place in primary. And the other one is moderate learning difficulties, and this is a tricky one because language is so tied up with conceptual understanding. So to understand what's going on in the classroom, to understand teaching instruction, you need to understand the language. If you haven't been picking it up year on year on year on year on year, then a child has massive gaps, all right, in their learning. So this can come to present very much as a moderate learning difficulty. So what, and again, the differentiator is quite skilled, but actually if the language level is really simplified, how does the young person respond? Okay, so then we can start to make a difference between what's moderate learning difficulties versus versus a DLD. So the DLD process diagnosing is complex, and part of my role through NAPLIC is really developing the skills and knowledge of speech and language therapists to be making these the diagnosis. So it has to be, it is time consuming, it takes some time, because we have to look at collecting evidence from obviously the young person themselves, working one-to-one with them, with families, with staff who work with the young person, collating that all together. And then obviously making that decision and ruling out other conditions as well. So it takes some time, and obviously then building on what we do next is important as well. So okay, so it's not something to say, oh, that child has DLD. It's not a quick diagnosis to make. It takes some time to do. And I'm hoping there's lots of Senkos in the audience today. And one of my I guess potentially controversial points is refer anyway, okay, because DLD is serious, okay. It has serious impacts on learning, it has serious impacts on mental health, okay, and mental well-being. So if we're not starting that process with a referral, that young person, it doesn't go away, right? DLD doesn't go away. This young person is carrying this forever. And yes, there isn't enough money, okay. We know there's not enough money, but how are we ever going to know the need unless there are referrals? So I've seen some documents in the last few weeks, where the DFE are saying there's 72,000 children, young people on speech language therapy waiting lists in England. All right, and they're using that. We need to work things out. We need to sort things out. That 72,000 is a massive report. That's the number actually on the waiting list. They've collected that from the NHS trusts, right? So that is the figure, but it's because most of those children are held, aren't they? They're not referred at all. So please refer. I used to be a manager of a speech language therapy service, and whilst we were always under pressure to manage our waiting list, that was always a big thing with our commissioners. But with a waiting list, we can go on and say, we're doing everything we can, we're working really efficiently, we need more resources, okay. Unless we have that evidence, we can't build for more resources. We're like to be cut. All right, so really, please keep referring and don't hold back, even if there are waiting lists. Hopefully there'll be some questions about that afterwards. We can have some discussions in a few minutes. Okay, but what do we do? And it's really about building a graded system, right? A universal target and specialist, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, because 7.6%, they're there anyway. We don't know most of them, but actually what we can do is build a system which supports more and more students. So most young people will not get EHCPs. Most young people with DLD will not get EHCPs. There's just too many of them. So we have to build really robust systems at all levels. So in the classroom with targeted support, but also for those who have higher needs at the specialist support level as well. So probably the most powerful thing to do is that just staff are aware of language and aware of DLD. And I am, I guess, surprised sometimes about how more thought isn't given to language, and certainly how to make it simpler. So actually we can try and build on that, really, is by understanding there are children and young people in every single classroom who are having difficulties understanding, and they don't say it. All right, so what we've got to do is be more proactive and make that presumption that we need to break down the language. And I guess and one key message is, the more important the message, the more modification it needs. The simpler the words, the shorter the sentences, the more non-verbal communication. Okay, so it needs to be. So spoken language can be taught explicitly. I think there's something like oracy approaches are very powerful here, but again, breaking them down and making them accessible, because otherwise there's a real trap with some of the oracy approaches I've seen is they become very verbal very quickly. Right, so you've got to break them down to be really helpful so that they are accessible for all our learners. And you can do that by using I've just got a whole school of vocabulary approaches, which some of my work that I do, right? They're accessible by using taking the approaches which work with specialists at that specialist level and applying them at whole school level. And the key one is multisensory learning, right? So the issue with DLD is language, spoken language. Okay, so what is heard isn't being processed at the same way. So what can we do? How can we get that learning in there in another way? And the most obvious, most accessible way is visually. Okay, what visual supports? Can we use diagrams? Can we use images? Can we use video? Right, all of those things, just doing those extra will support learning, but also multisensory learning, the hands-on elements as well. So the more multisensory you can get, the better. And then another key strategy to use is comprehension monitoring. So this is basically for children to say, I don't understand. But that is a very, very big challenge. And that's a challenge for adults, but it's an even bigger challenge for adolescents, right? In front of their peers, it becomes increasingly difficult. So establishing this as a whole school culture is that always checking understanding in different ways. So it can't just be, do you understand? Because it's very easy to say yes, even if you don't understand, right? So keeping that going across all age ranges. Okay, at tier 2 is we want to be thinking about what strategies and what structures we need to have in place to support DLD. Okay, so DLD is really common, right? So rather than waiting to have students that come in, how are we going to support them individually, there'll be some themes. Okay, if we come back to our what we call our DLD bubble, we call it. Okay, there are different themes. Do we have vocabulary approaches? Do we have approaches which support sentences? Do we have approaches which develop the discourse? Okay, so thinking about those, are staff trained? Do they know what to do? And I think importantly, when we're thinking about any kind of support tier 2 level, is making sure they're really linked to class and the curriculum. We know that children with learning difficulties, and including those with DLD, find transfer from one situation from one thing to another difficult. If an intervention is in a group, its transfer is not automatic to the classroom. So making sure that is explicitly linked is really important. And we're developing skills and strategies. There is no cure for DLD. Okay, so whatever you're going to do extra is going to develop vocabulary, it's going to develop sentences, but it's not, the DLD is still going to be there. Okay, so just to be aware of that as well. So here's some more widely known approaches that might be useful. All of these are on the link sheet that you'll get as part of the presentations. There's links to all of these different things. So sentences, so colorful semantics and shape coding are both visual ways of teaching sentence formation. Okay, so and teaching grammar. Okay, so you can really so using color and shape to really show the different parts of a sentence. PTV, which is pre-teaching vocabulary, some resources on the NAPLIC website. And then also Word Aware 3, something that I've done is a kind of pre-teaching supporting vocabulary. So exposing children to repetition. So they hear the word more times and they go into the classroom with some advanced knowledge. So when that word is taught in the whole class, they have some understanding of it and can then build on that rather than playing catch up all the time. They already start a little bit ahead and then keep up. And then the discourse things are so things like narrative skills. So there's like it's like talk for writing. The actual story structure is very structured, very useful. but often that goes at too fast a rate for many children with DLD, or they're not ready to learn it at that time. So starting it, the narrative, the skills can be taught in a structured way at a slower rate. And Language for Thinking and Language for Behaviour and Emotions are two books that I've written with colleagues, which look at the inference and verbal reasoning in particular. So being able to read between the lines and talk about why and how things happen, to make some sort of social understandings around language. And then giving social opportunities. So things like Lego therapy, okay, can be useful. Just general supportive clubs informally, but also explicitly teaching playground games as well. And then my former colleagues in Hackney have developed an app called Verbo, which is where they've integrated a lot of the support strategies, such as these ones here, and their video sessions and resources that schools can buy into. I have no financial interest in that. It's an NHS funded thing. And then tier 3 is really obviously the specialist support level, where you need more specialists and individual skills for those more children, young people with more complex skills. And a couple of really useful things I find is DLD and Me, which is a resource developed by Anna Sabatz and Amanda Feiner. And this is a group session which goes through children's understanding of DLD. What is DLD? Okay, and how does it impact me? And what can I do? What do others need to do to support me? So, and it leaves children leaving, with a sense of empowerment about what they, really what they can do. And I think it's really important for children to, at that young age, to start to build those self-advocacy skills, as that's really starts to help mitigate against some of the mental health impacts that can be felt later. And then just something like that, having a chat. I've got DLD, class teacher knows about it. Having a conversation about it is very powerful as well. And then with some of the work we do with NAPLIC and another charity called Aphasic, is we work with families, for the families to have a deeper understanding of DLD as well. And we've set up a network of trained professionals who are delivering that across the country. Okay, so it's about this totally connected network. And then just raise it, because awareness is so important. So RADLD is the international organization for raising awareness of DLD. So the poster is from last year, but this year's date is Friday, October the 18th. And we run a whole lot of different events that you can also just look on the website closer to the time. There'll be lots of resources, or make links in your local area and get involved to raise awareness. There's lots of select presentations as well. Some other resources, I'll go through this in just a moment. I have left enough time to look at this in a moment. So interactive resource on our website as well. But just to finish on NAPLIC, so just come back to things. So if you go to naplic.org.uk, that's our website. I'm going to show you some resources in just a moment. There's lots of resources there for professionals, as well as school and family resources, and then you can follow us on social media as well. And welcome to join. And then just this is a freebie to do from our publisher. So I've written some books on vocabulary. So Word Aware 1 is a whole school vocabulary approach. Word Aware 2 is early years, but at whole class level. Word Aware 3 is a targeted intervention for supporting vocabulary, so pre-teaching vocabulary. And Language for Thinking and Language for Behaviour and Emotions both relate to verbal reasoning and inference. So if you go to that QR code, or else just on that URL at the bottom there, and just you can use Twinkl 30, that will give you a 30% discount. So I'll leave that there just for a couple of seconds more. And then I want to show the video, not video, the website very quickly. The vocabulary resources I spoke about are here under PTV. And then the DLD resources are here. All right. And so there's resources for professionals. Just go here. Okay. And then there's the toolkit, which I've already opened just here. Okay. And so you can click on it here, and It has an interactive toolkit which has lots and lots of, you just keep going right to the right, lots and lots of resources and strategies and links all around developmental language disorder are all here. And then there's a really great tool, there's general strategies. And if you keep clicking, somewhere here it is. Okay, so this comes back to this bubble resource, and there's you can download it's called Bubble Pupil Check, and what it does is this one here. It's the bubble like that, and then you can move these to different areas to show, to identify a child's strengths and needs. So actually, it's a really useful strategy to do with a young person and do with families as well. So you sort of develop some of that insight and skills there. Okay, and then the other one is there's the back onto, sorry, on the DLD page, there's also DLD resources for schools and families, and there's some videos with some handouts that can be used as a simple, either working with families directly or as a quick kind of information slot on a staff meeting or inset.